Greetings, greetings, greetings. It is I, David Stewart, the everyday skeptic, your friendly neighborhood thought criminal and confirmed Russian spy working to undermine your confidence in the socialist U.S. government. What am I going to talk about today? Bias and trusted sources. Of course, you should not trust a Russian agent such as myself, but who can you trust? And should you trust anyone? Let me work backwards from there. Let me start with the should you trust anyone. From a skeptical perspective, you should always be asking for evidence of things, right? The thing which is most true and the thing which you can most reliably say is true is the thing which is going to have the most evidence in most cases. So yes, you should always be asking for reason and evidence for everything that's presented to you. The problem is with news stories, those aren't really presented as just like a series of facts. They're presented as a story. I've talked about this in other videos because that's the way we understand things. We understand things as stories, not as just like factoids. So they're usually codified as a story. And the other problem with that is that most people don't have time to do all that work for every little piece of information that comes across their eyes in a given day. They don't have time to look at a news story and grab it from 18 different sources and see all the facts and extract all the facts out of the narrative and construct the truthful narrative or that which they believe is most likely to be the truth. Most people don't have time to do that every day. And there's a bunch of different circumstances where you may not have the tools to understand the evidence at all as a layperson. So if you read like you read a news blurb about some new study that came out in the New England Journal of Medicine, if you're not a doctor or like a trained medical professional, going and looking up that research report for yourself and looking at the evidence for yourself, or really just the record of the evidence for yourself, may be fruitless if you don't have the background needed to properly interpret the data. And in some cases, a research paper may have an interpretation of the data that doesn't match their own data, and that's a really, really hard thing to do for every little thing that comes across your desk. Now, one of the things that I would like to do eventually on the channel, and I kind of started this like 2 or 3 years ago, and maybe I'd like to pick it up. Maybe that'll be a goal for like 2017, is to talk about some tools that you can have to know when you see something like that, whether it's likely to be completely bogus, whether it's likely that it's not accurately reported, or whether it's probably true, without having to do a whole lot of all this extra work that we're talking about. Because most people don't have time with it. I certainly don't have time to look at every little news story and deconstruct it and reconstruct the narrative the way I did with like the United Airlines fiasco. I don't have time to do that every single day for every single story. I got to get just information and put it in so I can process it while I'm doing all my other myriad of things, trying to write books and going to work and doing all that other kind of stuff. And most people have lives like me. They're busy. They don't have time to do this skeptic thing for every little thing. It's impractical for you to empirically test every single thing in life. So that means that having a trusted source, having reliable, faithful people giving you the information is actually kind of an important thing from a practical perspective. If you're going to follow if you're going to be an everyday skeptic, it's good to see if you can get your information from a source you know is going to not always be putting a spin on it, or at least you have a really good understanding of their bias already. And this is where I think most people fail, is they don't have a clear understanding of the bias of somebody presenting information to them. And this is why in a lot of my videos, I'll start with my biases. When I was like talking about Erdogan and Mark Rutte, I was like, guys, I'm Dutch. My family's Dutch. This is why I'm talking about it. And so you know exactly right away. And it's not that I'm anti-Turkish. I want I want Turkey to be great, but you know that it's like I'm coming from my heritage, and my family happens to be from, certainly my wife's family is from the Netherlands. So I like to start with my biases when I present information so that you can make some of those judgments for yourselves. And all sources carry with them usually a set of perspective bias at the very least. It's really, really hard to be objective, and I would say it's improbable that any source that you're going to look at is going to be objective, but at the very least you should have a good idea of their biases, and you should have an idea of whether those biases are going to really remove a lot of information for you, in which cases and how. And that's an important thing to evaluate with any source. So if you're looking at something like the New York Times, we know that it's got a really, really strong leftist bias, and it does that, and I've demonstrated that on this channel before. that doesn't mean that there's no valid information coming out of the New York Times. It just means when you read a piece from the New York Times, you need to understand that it's written from their biases and that you should be critical of any spin that looks like it's leaning in that sort of political direction. And not all of it is going to, because some of it is going to be neutral and not matter all that much, but you should be at least aware of that from your sources. That's what sort of having trusted sources is. And the other half of having trusted sources is that if you have a source that that has lied a lot, and I kind of touched on this on like the Thunderfoot video, but I want to think about it a little more broadly. If you have a source that lies a lot or consistently misrepresents information in a way that's meant to deceive you and is possibly capable of deceiving you, that's not a source that you should rely on to get your information on a regular basis if you can avoid it. So like if you're watching CNN or something like that, and even if you're aware of CNN's bias, they're probably omitting so many different things from any particular narrative that their information is useless. And the reason I can say they probably do that is that that's what they've done in the past really consistently for the past like 10 or 15 years. And if they've done it for a really long time consistently, they shouldn't be a trusted source. Now, I know people are going to be thinking about a lot of my sophistry videos that if you attack the credibility of the person making the argument, that's a fallacy, right? But I'm not talking about that in a sort of a debate. What I'm talking about this is just a practical piece of advice. If somebody lies all the time, you have a very limited amount of time that you can give attention to people or things or whatever you happen to be doing. There's no reason to be giving your attention to somebody who lies to you all the time when you can probably get that same information with less likelihood of lies, let's say, from a different perspective. The other problem with all of this is that there's virtually no, certainly if you're looking at mainstream media, there's virtually no source in the mainstream media, like I said, that doesn't have that bias. So you have to kind of pick which one you think is going to give you the most facts most often, and if they're giving you facts in with one particular political slant, that you're able to maybe think about looking at another source. Right now it's really hard because the mainstream media doesn't have very many really objective sources at all. So that's the hard thing. Now it's easy for me to say, well, you need to be critical and think about the biases of your sources and figure out which sources lie the least. Well, which sources are going to lie the least? And I'm going to give you, this is my practical piece of advice here, is that the physically closer to whatever news event you happen to be looking at, the more likely it is to be true. So for instance, if we look at the United Airlines video I did a while back, the true story, the story that was closest to what actually happened and revealed the things that none of the mainstream media types really wanted to talk about, was from Chicago, because it happened in Chicago. So the newspapers that were physically close to the event reported more facts than the ones that were physically far away, and there's a couple reasons for that. The first one is, like with the United Airlines one, whatever happens is part of the political sphere of that locality that is full of things that are relevant to everywhere else. So they're going to be picking up on more of these things and contextualizing them within their local sphere. So in the case of the United Airlines, dragging the passenger off, a lot of people didn't realize that it was government agents that did it. It was a special police force that Chicago made just to be at the airport that was actually quite controversial in Chicago, based on what the Chicago Sun-Times and the Chicago Tribune were saying about this event and about this police force in general. And when we read their story, all of a sudden we get a contextualization of the local politics, where there's a lot of controversy over whether this weird little police force should exist. And they've been asking to have guns, and now they violently remove this passenger, and so that's sort of dashing their hopes of being deadly armed kind of upon the rocks. And what we got in that local report was just a lot more facts. We got more facts that probably if someone at the New York Times was looking at it, they'd be like, well, a national audience doesn't really care about this little political fight that they're having in Chicago over some weird little police force. So we'll just leave that part out. And maybe that's their more beneficent thinking versus like, we don't want to say that the government did this, let's make it seem like United Airlines did it. But there's probably a million things that actually just kind of pass through a filter and get sort of cut out by the AP and other organizations because they're viewed as irrelevant when you pull them out of that local context. But that local context is important because just by its existence, it created more facts in that case. So whenever something happens, if you can go to like the newspaper or the broadcast news that's right there where it's going to happen, they're going to probably give you a lot more facts than a national news organization would. That's a really, really good piece of practical advice that I'd like to give to you whenever you're wanting to look at the way like a news narrative is sort of unfolding. If something happens in Atlanta, you want to look at whatever newspapers are and whatever TV stations are talking about it in Atlanta. You don't want to be just relying on the New York Times for your information because they're automatically applying a lens before they even think about what information they're going to give you as to what they feel like is important or relevant, and they're going to give you sort of a sliced down story or a spun story based on what they think is relevant to a national audience or to their particular audience, which may not be as conservative as you and may be quite a bit more liberal as what they're imagining their audience to be. Likewise, if you're watching Fox News, they're going to spin it onto the right. They're going to spin it for a really conservative audience, and that may not be you. You may be a more liberal-leaning person, and so you got to be aware of that. So that's my big practical advice, is that the closer you physically get to what's happening to an original, like first-hand source, the more accurate and the more facts are going to be presented to you. And you can, as an individual, pretty efficiently it's easier to have 10 efficiently listed facts and discard like 3 of them that don't matter and remember the 7 that do, than it is to read a long news narrative that has those 7 contextualized into a story. You're not really losing time by having to think critically while you're reading a short little newspaper article. So that's my advice on there. It's hard to find trusted sources, but the main thing that comes through trusted sources, they're not going to consistently be lying to you, even if they happen to have a bias, and especially a perspective bias. So let me know your thoughts down below. I always appreciate it. Just as a by the by, I did finish my book. I will do some follow-up videos specifically on the fiction stuff. If you want to support me, of course, you can buy my fiction books. That's like my main thing I try to do. I will come out with a nonfiction book at some point. I don't know if it'll be in 2017 because I'm pretty busy with more novels coming out, but I'll try to put some of this stuff in a book so that all the information that I think is valid for people to sort of navigate this crazy world and be sort of well informed and skeptical of bad information, sort of all in one place. Anyway, I appreciate it though, and I'll see you next time. Don't forget to leave me your thoughts and your well wishes, as well as your hate and your anger directed towards me for undermining your political system as a Russian operative.